Hello, my name is Reverend Bill Spangler-Dunning, and I serve as the regional minister for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Virginia. And this is DOCTALKs, a ministry of the Christian Church in Virginia for the enrichment of all who would listen. Today is a special episode of DOCTALKs focused on how disciples understand and approach Scripture, the what and why we approach Scripture this way. If you remember, this is a series on disciples' identity, and I encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episodes, but particularly I want to do a little bit of review before we get to how we approach Scripture as disciples. If you remember in the earlier episode, we talked about how rejection of the hierarchy systems of other churches that told local congregations and individuals what they could believe, how they were supposed to worship, and so on. We adopted a system in which we believe that each congregation should be congregationally governed, meaning that they could make decisions for themselves. And but they also had a covenantal piece that we were to do that as individual congregations and as individuals, make our decisions on that level, but never apart from the full community, meaning that community was a very important part of the authority process. And this affects Scripture for us today, too. For disciples, we believe that each individual, you and me, have the freedom and the responsibility to read, to study, and interpret Scripture for ourselves. That's really important because in the earlier church, individuals, particularly laity, were not allowed to do that. You had to be specially trained to read Scripture and interpret it for yourself. And this also applied to churches that gave all the power to interpretation to individual clergy and not laity. But disciples believe that the priesthood of all believers. And that means that clergy and laity have that individual responsibility to read, study, and interpret Scripture on our own. That's where it begins. But important like structure, we were never meant to do that isolated. We were meant to do that in community. And that's why, again, with the journals from the earlier episode, while our founders would write about how they understood things, particularly how they interpret Scripture, as it guided our life. And then others, clergy and laity, would write in and sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. They would debate back and forth over time, the social media of the time, a little slower, but you get the point. Community and interpretation of Scripture went together. And the reason why it did lies partly in an example from Reverend Dr. James Shannon. He was the first president of my alma mater, Culver Stockton College, though at the time it was called Christian University in Canton, Missouri. The actual freshman dorm was named after James Shannon. It was called Shannon Hall. I never knew anything about him at all. Didn't even know he was the first president. I only knew it because of the plaque on the building that's where I went every day at the end of the day for my freshman year. But here's the thing with James Shannon. He did something with Scripture that is an example of why community was so important when we as disciples interpret Scripture, and why we don't just do it individually or allow one person or one hierarchy to tell us what Scripture believes. It had to do with the time it was written. I will put the link in this video so you can go read the whole document, but it's a 25-page treatise on it was really a speech where he talked about how all Christians should support slavery during the Civil War, because Scripture, as he read it, clearly supported slavery. And if you didn't support slavery as a Christian, he argued that you didn't believe in the Bible. He wasn't alone. There were many clergy and laity who used Scripture to support and defend the atrocious practice of owning another person, to enslaving them. We now, as we look back at history, think that's absolutely wrong. How could anyone interpret Scripture or use Scripture to do that? Half the church said, as they read the life of Jesus, they couldn't believe that this is what God ever wanted. And so the church divided during the Civil War. What people don't realize is that the church divided before the country. And our own Reverend Dr. James Shannon was part of that. Read this article and you will see that if we just simply let one person interpret scripture, or we left out that part of the community that added a check onto our understanding of how we read scripture, the world would be really awful, divided up, and really ugly. And that's why, as disciples, how we approach scripture is that we encourage each, you and me, to read, study, and interpret what scripture is saying. But we always know that our own human experience, the time of which we live, the things that we know, the things that we don't know, get in the way or become part of our interpretation of scripture, because scripture doesn't say anything itself. We read it, but it has to go through our mind, through our experiences. And that means sometimes we see scripture saying some really horrible things, or we use it to support some really horrible things. Our check in disciples is always the wider community. It's why we gather as assembly. It's why we gather together in the larger communities, and we share with each other how we interpret, how we see scripture, and we let others challenge us with that. This is why when we approach scripture, it's really important that you take serious your responsibility to read scripture. That's the first thing I want to encourage everybody to do. Read scripture. Look at it. Figure out what you think it means for both your life and for those in your community. But don't just stop there. Actually, ask others what they think, not even just in your local congregation, but be willing to be challenged by others who might see it differently. If you look at our world right now, we are in a time when people on both sides of many issues are using scripture to defend their position. We as disciples believe that the only way scripture can be a source of authority for us is if we do it within the whole community. And this means both clergy and laity. A note to my alma mater, Culver Stockton College. Thank you for taking the time to study it, to discern the history of Dr. James Shannon, and deciding to rename the freshman hall to Dr. John Sperry Hall, one of my favorite professors of history and astronomy. Changed my life, and I'm proud that that hall is now named after him. Thank you very much. Look forward to the next episode on disciple identity.